So let's have a look at these waves in detail. Let me bring up my oscilloscope. So first of all, let's have a look at the saw wave, see what it looks like. Right, no surprises there really. It kind of looks like a sawtooth, which is why it's called a saw wave. Let's have a look at a square wave, or a pulse wave actually. Okay, so that is a square wave. It's called a square wave because it's completely square. It goes up, along, down, along, up, and 50% up and 50% down is a particular type of pulse wave called a square wave. So a square wave actually is a pulse wave, just a particular type. Now, if I vary the width of the pulse so that up is different than down, so it's not symmetrical, you can see it changes the sound and the harmonic content. Now that's a very thin pulse wave. That's like 10% up and 90% down. That's about 25%. Back to that particular type of pulse wave, which is 50% up, 50% down, which is known as a square wave. These two types of waves are the most harmonically rich and the most used in subtractive synthesis, merely because they have more stuff to take away, so that if you start off with lots of stuff, that's an advantage if you start off with lots of harmonics. Incidentally, on albino, if you have a saw wave, you can vary the width of the pulse on a saw wave also. I'm modulating the width of the pulse there. On square wave, that sounds like and otherwise known as pulse width modulation, or PWM. You see that on lots of old analog synths, or most of them in fact. Now let's have a look at the other two waves, the triangle and the sine wave. I'll switch to this oscillator for that. So what do we have here? There's a sine wave, an interesting wave because it has absolutely no harmonics whatsoever. If I sweep the low pass filter down to filter off the harmonics, as you'll see on the top right filter section, halfway nothing's happened. About 3/4 and something starts to happen. What's happening? It just turns the volume down until we're left with almost nothing. As I open up the filter, it just turns the wave up, or allows it through. Now why is that? Well, it's because the sine wave has absolutely no harmonics whatsoever. It just is a fundamental note with no overtones. So there's nothing to filter out except the fundamental note itself. So once the low pass filter reaches the frequency of that note, it will just filter it out. In other words, it will attenuate it or turn it down. So, interesting wave. Now if I put some resonance on the filter, where is it there? And I'm sweeping the filter down, there's a slight spike there once it hits the resonant bump on the filter, but essentially the same thing. Nothing happens. Okay, so don't use a sine wave for subtractive synthesis, or don't expect any results if you filter a sine wave, because there's nothing to filter out. Okay, so what's the use of a sine wave then? Well, quite. But it is pretty useful for some things. One, it makes great spooky leads and blippy type sounds, which featured a lot in the early Goa stuff. Now we know there's a particular exponent of that kind of sound, and myself as well, early Cosmosis stuff. It makes because the sound doesn't exist in nature, it makes a particularly spooky sound, and it's great with a bit of portamento added for kind of ethereal type leads, secondary parts mainly. It's also really good for beefing up bass lines, perhaps not psytrance fast bass lines, although I have used it as that in the past, mixed with another wave in the same octave. What's going on here is if you add that a sine wave to say a saw wave, what you're doing is you're reinforcing the fundamental note. In other words, just beefing it up to emphasize the actual note that the bass line is, rather than any of the harmonics. That's another good use. It's also a very good utility wave, so you can make kick drums and all kinds of sweeping low frequency effects with sine waves. So it has a lot of actual uses, but not so much when it comes to filtering and creating sounds. Now, the last wave we'll look at is the triangle wave, which is quite similar in a way to the sine wave. It's kind of a cross between that and the other two waves we looked at earlier. Now this is a triangle wave. Again, triangle for obvious reasons, called triangle because it is triangular. It has harmonics, but also has a very strong fundamental note. So as I sweep down, that's filtering out most of the harmonics now. Now you're just left with pretty much a sine wave, the fundamental note. It has a particular type of harmonic series attached to it. If I bring up the resonance to emphasize it, we'll do another sweep. So a different type of sound than sweeping a saw wave. What's the use of a triangle? Again, some spooky leads, and it's also particularly good for very fat off-bass sounds. I used it once or twice on the mumbo jumbo material when it was more proggy and more of an just a straight offbeat bass. You can make very obese sounds with it. Triangle. Now, while we have the oscilloscope here, let's go and have a look at a saw wave once we add some resonance, just out of curiosity what's happening with the harmonics. So turn the resonance up, sweep the filter. You can see it has a lot more harmonics than a saw wave, sorry, than a triangle wave. Huge amounts, in fact, as you can see. And now the square wave. Add some resonance. Similarly, has many more harmonics, as you can see. And pulse. So, as you can see, the first two waves that we talked about, the pulse and the saw, are much more harmonically rich than the other two. Okay, so that concludes our look at the basic subtractive waveforms for now.